Hello, this is Shirley Bard, and I'm going to be the interviewer for this veteran history story today that will be submitted to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. We are here in San Diego, California, at the home of Gloria and Bill Lantzer. I am a personal friend, and I'm very honored to be able to do this. Good morning, Bill. Thank you for allowing me to be the one to record this very memorable time in your life. We will begin by talking about your life prior to joining Uncle Sam. Can you take a few minutes and let us know a few things about yourself, for example? Like birth date, where you were born, what your family life was like back in the days before you went into the military.
Hello, my name is William Lantzer, and I was born in Bedford, Ohio, in January 19th, 1930. There was a big story about my family when I was born. Was having a party, and I was being my mother at that particular time had a room on the second floor of the house, and I was being born that day, and the police was raiding the house for illegal drinking. And I was told that story by my mother, and it's something to think about. So anyway, this little town of Bedford, it didn't have very many people. It had probably about 7,000 at the most. And I lived there for 17 years before I decided to move on. But in those years, I wasn't a very good student in school, and I used to jock school, and of course I always was learning things. I used to have a lot of fun. I was very energetic. I needed money to do the things I wanted to do with, so I had to find a job. So when I was about 12 and a half, going on 13, I got me a job working in a bowling alley, setting out pins. Then the war comes along, and I'm still doing that kind of work for a few years. I'm making good money. At that particular time, I thought $40 a week or more was good money. And I bought a lot of things and enjoyed life. And about 1946, I was in a post office, in the post office at that time they had recruiting officers, and some sergeant, Army sergeant, approached me and he said, "Would you like to join the service?" And I, at that particular time, wasn't very interested. Of course, the war was going on, and the Second World War was going on. And I thought about that later on. And I went home to my mother. Now, my mother and I were living alone, and she didn't like it too much about me going in the service so young, and I kind of talked her into it, and so she had to sign the papers for me to go in when I was 17. Well, I wasn't quite 17. I was only 16. My birthday is in January, but I went in December the prior year. So I remember very distinctly the day that I went into the service, which was December 24th, Christmas Eve. And I left Cleveland, Ohio, and I presume there must have been about 500 or 600 or more other recruits on the same train. And that was on Christmas Eve. And everybody was talking about Christmas. Well, it didn't mean much to me. I never celebrated holidays. I never had before that. And so anyway, we just kept on going on. It was all day and all night. I think it took us about 2 days or more to get to South Carolina.
Bill, how did you happen to pick the branch of service that you chose?
Well, the recruiting officer, it wasn't an officer, it was an enlisted man at the time, was sergeant. He was in the Army. And he said, well, you have no problem getting in the Army. And so the train finally got to Fort Jackson in South Carolina. And it was in the evening. I don't know why it is, but trains always come in the evenings. And everybody disembarked, and of course we got in ranks, more or less, lined up. And we didn't have no clothes except our suitcases. And they took us to a large building, like an auditorium, you want to call it. And from there they broke us down into different groups. And from there we went into regular barracks.
Well, when you first signed up, you signed your name, there it was, it's a done deal. What were your thoughts after you had made that decision?
Well, it was just a signature on a piece of paper I had signed.
Well, was it anticipation?
My mother had to fill out the forms because of the parental consent because of my age. And
what was her reactions to see her little boy?
well, she didn't like it too much. She didn't cry or nothing like that, but it was emotional for her. And I promised to write to her and all that, and we'll discuss that later. But anyway, it was a very good experience for me because I figured that I would do better myself because I was having problems in civilian life. I mean, I had no real friends, and I wasn't in the group, you want to call it, for high school kids, and I didn't graduate. So that was and I didn't want to go to school. I would learn everything by my own experience.
Well, once you got in that environment where you're really thrown together with a bunch of other guys just like you, what was that like then?
Well, that was a good experience. I had prior experience in group because I had some friends as I was growing older that worked in gas stations, and I used to do mechanical work and all that, help them. So I wasn't dumb. Like, I was more than average because I self-taught myself everything. When I was going to school, the teachers would always criticize me. Did you read this or read that? And I did read it, but N plus. And I more or less taught myself how to read and do math, and because I hadn't been to school that much in my younger years.
But when you got in the military then, and it was suddenly structured, and it was, you will do it this way and you will do it now, what was that transition like?
Well, I had no problem taking orders, and in later years in the service I give a few. And I learned a lot of things in the service, that's for sure.
Well, what was your first job when you first went in?
Well, let me explain. We went to this camp, I think it's called camp now, it was in Fort Jackson at that time.
In what state was that?
In South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a large camp, and this was before they had the draft, the national draft. And that didn't come until later years, in '48. And so it was all volunteers. Well, you go through a process of indoctrination of where you take tests for 3 days, all kinds of tests. And I did so good on the test. I was one of the top 200, and there's about 1,000 of us. There was about 1,000 of us in this whole group that was taking these tests, and I was in the top 200. I don't know what it is, but they picked out 200 of the people that they wanted to have to go to take this special training. They approached me and asked me if I wanted to take this special training. So they say in the Army, you don't volunteer. Well, I did. And I had done it quite a bit afterwards too, because I always wanted something more to do. So they got the 200 of us out of this group of 1,000, and they put us on another train, and they sent us to Fort Knox, Kentucky. And it's another trip. When we got to this other base, is nighttime, and I don't know why they do that, but anyway, you're fumbling around in the dark, you know, and they get everything organized, and we finally was put in our designated barracks, where I was there for 6 months.
So you spent the night in a barracks, arriving at night,
Yes.
awaking the next morning with your new adventure.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
It's always a new experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a folder with a picture of my whole company. With this, we was the 4th group of trainees that was put through this. This is the graduation photographs of us.
Okay, that says 4th Training Company. What are those initials?
UMT, Universal Military Training.
Experimental Unit, 1948 in Fort Knox, Kentucky. And you were in the 1st platoon. Oh no, you were in the 2nd platoon.
I was in the 3rd platoon.
The 3rd platoon.
Yes. Now we had these officers and trainees up here, the enlisted men, were all the officers were West Point trained. Our captains and our lieutenants were all West Point trained. The enlisted personnel, the sergeants and such that were in charge of the platoons and other instructors were all well trained in their different areas. And we had our choice of what area we wanted to go into for training. There was the tanks, and there was the artillery, infantry, and engineers. Well, because of my experience in mechanical work and all that, I took the engineers. Well, that was a good choice, and I followed through on that on my whole military experience.
Well, this isn't your only, this was your maiden voyage into the military, but you had subsequent voyages. And how did that happen?
I took basic training at Fort Knox, and also at Fort Knox they had what they called at that time extended training. It's just like taking a basic training another 12 weeks. But the basic training in that time was 12 weeks, and for another 12 weeks I learned all about building bridges, excavating with power equipment, dozers and such, and I went through that whole course, and then we had our ceremony. We had the commanding general of the I don't remember his name anymore, but he was the base commander at that time, come down and shook everybody's hands. And our company was dispersed from there. And very few of the people or the men that were in my outfit I ever saw again. I was sent back to Fort Jackson, and that is an infantry installation. Well, I didn't want to stay in that. So after and I was put in charge of a barracks sergeant, and I was a PFC. Well, I didn't think the rank qualified me to be a barracks sergeant. I thought I should have more rank, and I wasn't going to get it there, I don't think. So I said, I got to find a way to get out of here. And I went down to personnel, and they was very, very convenient down there. And then I kind of talked to one sergeant that was working there, and well, he said, if you want to make a decision to get transferred, you have to go see an officer. So I had to go see a first lieutenant that was there, and he was very cordial. And he says, well, if you are not satisfied here, he says, we'll see about getting you transferred. And he says, well, you know what? There is an opening for you with your qualifications in Arkansas. And there was a little camp down there called Fort Smith. And that's right near a town called Fort Smith. And I'd never been to Arkansas before, but I had traveled around the country before that. So I said, okay, that's good. And I didn't know what I was getting into until I got there. Well, what it was a camp that was set up after. Now this was in 1948. In the early years, the early months of 1948.
Well, that's after the war in Europe was over.
Yes. Oh, yes. And I was assigned to headquarters outfit there, and I met up with some other enlisted men and a few officers that were there. Now, there was just 5 of us to begin with, just five enlisted men. And then they told me what they was sent there for, because all of us were sent there. We're supposed to take these barracks that had been used after the Second World War, where they had the veterans come back from overseas to discharge them, and they had to have a full, complete physical. And these barracks, there was about 300 of them, to be exact. We never counted all of them, but we got over 200, and there was still more to go. And we were supposed to recondition these barracks, of which it was a standard Army barracks, 2 floors, and we had to do a lot of work in them because they had been sitting there for a few years, and all of the plumbing had to be checked, all the windows had to be replaced that were broken, doors fixed, and in every 5th barracks was a building set up for physical examinations, of which they had x-ray machines and all that in there. Well, these rooms, they'd made a partitioned room that were lead lined because of x-rays, and they were just rolled up well, we rolled it up. It was just sheets of lead. And we just took the nails out and just laid the sheets on the floor and rolled them up.
Well, how long were you there?
And this went on for approximately 6 months. And that was 1948. And they was going to start the draft. They're going to initiate it because it was already voted on in Congress. They started the draft in that year. And I think that was somewhere around February. I didn't want the same situation I had at Fort Jackson of training new personnel, new troops. I said, I'm going to get out of here. So I did the same thing. I went to personnel, and I says, I'd like to be transferred. He said, well, that's kind of hard to do, you know. He said, we're expecting a lot of troops in and all that, you know, and we're going to need personnel. I said, well, is there any chance of getting overseas? He said, well, there's a good chance of that. He says, where would you like to go? And he gave me a choice: Alaska, or Hawaii, oh my gosh, Japan, or Okinawa. And I didn't want to go to Alaska, and Okinawa didn't look, you know, it's an island. So I picked Japan. And he said, well, it shows here in your personnel record you only got 11 months in. I had been in service at that time 11 months, almost to the date. So he says, we'll have to extend your service time, so that's the regulations. He says, well, I have to put you in for a re-enlistment. We'll get you what to call at that time a short discharge. And I said, okay. So that officer brought out these papers I had to fill out, and I signed them, and then, of course, I gave him this paper across the table, and he gave me my discharge in reverse. And I was never out of the service. But I went back to the barracks. He said, well, we'll notify you when we get some transportation. So I went back to the barracks, and had the rest of the day, and I was talking to some of the other fellas I knew that I am going back, going to Japan. He says, well, how'd you do that? And I told him. I said, just go down to personnel. And I think a couple other fellas did that same thing. At least they tried, because.
Well, isn't it kind of unusual for recruits or military personnel to be able to choose what they want to do?
Well, in those days, it was a little different than nowadays. Well, nowadays, these recruiters now, they say they're going to do this for you and they're going to do that. I don't know if they can or not.
I've heard
they promise you all kinds of
right.
things.
That's
But
what
in those days, they used to help you, I think. I know you hear bad experiences, but I never had no problems.
What happened when you landed in Japan?
Well, that's another story. The story is, the next morning, I got my orders, what they call orders cut. I had a piece of paper. I have this documented down. That's one thing for sure. I documented some of the things I had done in the service, and I have records of all this. And so the next morning, I left that base. I left it on a bus, and I went home for 30 days. They gave me a leave of absence, they called it, for 30 days before I went overseas. So I went home, my mother, and had a good time. And
Well, what did she think about you going to Japan?
well, she said, and it's the same thing she always said, write me letters. I never did. I'm sorry to say I was a very bad letter writer. So anyway, I met up with some of the other fellas I knew, and I told them about my experiences and all that, you know. And one other fellow, a friend of mine, he joined the service. He went to the Air Force, though. And I didn't see him for, 20 years. And he retired in 20 years, but he had married an Asiatic girl, a woman. I met her, and she was Japanese. He was over in Japan at the same time I was, and I didn't even know it because I never corresponded with him, you know. So that was very nice about that thing about a friend of mine joined the service. And I went to Seattle, I guess it was Seattle, Washington, yes, on that trip. I called it a trip. But they lived, the service guys had it bad there. It was in the wintertime. And anybody that had been in that kind of area where it rains, freezes, everything's ice for days, it's no fun. We lived in barracks that were single floor, we call them tar paper shacks, because it was in the outside lining of the buildings were tar paper, like you put in your roof. And in the barracks, it was a long building. It had 2 pot-bellied stoves in it, and you kept them going with coal. And it was like camping out. I did a lot of that when I was young. It didn't bother me none. But they had a volunteer. Everybody had each one of these barracks had to have 2 guys, you know, stoke the furnaces all night long, the stoves, to keep them warm. It was awful cold there. And finally, after being there, I think it was about 2 weeks, they put us on a ship, a troop ship, and sent us to Japan.
Whereabouts in Japan did you land?
Well, we got into Tokyo Harbor, and we got, at this particular time, I did not know where I was going to be assigned. And we disembarked off the ship after being on there for 2 weeks, 14 days I think it was, and that was an experience with all the sick people.
Oh, rough waters. Rough waters?
Everybody got seasick, but I think only me.
Why do you think you didn't?
Well, I don't know. That's rock and rolling never bothered me.
Oh, did you get more watch up on deck than the other guys? They were
I
down
wasn't
below?
allowed on decks. You know,
Oh.
wasn't allowed on decks because it was rough water. And I had previously, in the time I had been in the service, I had been busy. And I had a projectionist license to show movies. I went to school for that and learned how to run projectors and cameras and all that. So I went up to the service officer they had on board and told him that I was qualified to show movies. He says, that's fine, that's just what we need. He says, you go up to so-and-so room, I don't remember what room it was anymore, but it was on the upper decks, and they had a library up there of movies. and they had projection machines and all that. So all that 14 days that I was on board that ship, I showed movies. And while the other guys were all sick and doing other duties around the ship, you know, they had to keep everything clean. I don't know if you have a shipboard a ship full of people, it makes it messy. So they had to have police call 3 times a day. And I never did any of that.
Well, when you got to Japan, what was your first job there?
Well, the ship docked in Tokyo docks. I don't know where it was really. And I got off, and they put us on trucks and took us to a camp that was only a few miles away, and that was the 1st Cavalry Division. And from there, they assigned me to the 7th Regiment, and that was a very historic regiment that was in history books all over. General Custer and the Indians when he got annihilated, and that was a very ceremonial department of the
What
Army.
was it like to be in Japan and in a foreign country, especially in the situation we were in with Japan at that time? What was it like being there and moving about the civilian population? How were you treated by the Japanese?
Well, because of with the Army number, the MOS, I was an engineer. I could do any kind of I was with repairing utilities, they called it. We didn't have nothing to do. If we found something wrong, we had Japanese, and we had interpreters that speak English a little bit, and we would tell the Japanese what to do, and then they would do all the work. So we loafed all the time, and there was 4 of us in this group that I had. I was a part in this department, if you want to call it. It was called Repairing Utilities. We had our own vehicles, and we drove all over Japan, around Tokyo area and Yokohama, and some of the other local towns around.
And you were free to just go when you wanted to go?
Yes. And we'd go to Yokohama and pick up something, but it would take an hour or so of driving down there, and then we would just goof off the rest of the time. And we would go into the Japanese towns and talk with them. We had no problem with the Japanese. It was very cordial, very polite. Of course, that's the way they are. And you get to know the lifestyles of the Japanese in the cities. You have the busy people. In the farmland, they're always busy too, but they're farming. But wherever we would go, people there were very nice. Had no problems at all.
Were you able to compare the way they were towards Americans before and after the bomb dropped?
Well, I wasn't in on the bombing.
No, but I mean you.
But I realized the people were very polite. Nothing was ever mentioned about the war. Even the interpreters, the Japanese interpreters we had, one was a Japanese kamikaze pilot. He was an instructor. Very nice fellow. He was a young guy though. He was 22 years old, but he was an instructor. And the other one was in the Navy, but there was no more Navy, so he had to find a civilian job, and he learned a little bit of English by reading, I guess, and so he worked for the government, our government, and we got along very well. We had parties, like American soldiers do, and they didn't drink. They didn't drink.
Not even sake, huh?
No, they wasn't allowed to, and they didn't do it. We had all that stuff, but they weren't allowed. And in our base, we had a converted Japanese Navy base with the big buildings and beautiful places. And the rest of the enlisted men I was with, they had their duties to do too.
Well, had you ever been able to go to Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Oh, yes. Pardon me. We went on what they call oh my gosh, can't think of the correct word right now, maneuvers. We went on maneuvers at the foot of Mount Fuji. It's a big volcano in Japan. And the United States government had acquired the property or rented it or whatever you want to call it to have maneuvers. And the tents we had to live in was just what they call
the pup tents?
squad tents.
Oh.
Squad tents. You could put 8 people into them if you had to. And we went in, we bivouacked at the foot of the mountain, and I climbed. One day we had nothing to do. They gave us, it was just a show. It was a show, that whole maneuvers. They had the tanks and they had everything else, but we didn't do nothing.
Well, Mount Fuji has snow up on top of it, doesn't it?
Right at the peak, yes. And this was in the summertime, and it still had a little bit of snow cap. But we climbed there. It was 17,000 feet, something like 17,000 feet. It took me all day long.
Could you do it today?
No. I couldn't do that because it's up. It's high, and it's steep. That's what I was trying to think of, steep. They have paths. You follow the paths, one up and down.
What was your impression of those two cities?
The cities?
Yeah, Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
I went down there. We had 3 of us. We got in a truck and we went down there to see Hiroshima. And then we stayed down there all night because it was a long way to get down there. But we stayed in the Japanese hotel. But we just wanted to go down and see it. And the city. Now this was a couple of years after the bomb had been dropped. The city was vitalized. I mean, it was building, working, and you would never know. And we were surprised at the structures that were already there.
Well, after they have to rebuild after an earthquake, they're probably used to getting that kind of stuff done.
Well, the Japanese are very inventive, but you'll notice the Japanese, especially the women, when they walk, they take small steps and you look like they're running, but that's the way they do. And the Japanese are very industrious, you want to call it, and they're always in a hurry. And you don't ever see them standing around street corners and stuff like that. And at least the regular people.
So there wasn't any apparent hard feelings towards you folks when you were in your country?
I enjoyed socializing with the Japanese. We had our special places to go when we was off, on leave. And I went up to those mountaintops where they had the springs. We spend weekends up there, some of us guys, and just lounge around in the hot springs and drink sake, and they had very good beer there, and not drunk. I mean, there was a lot of problems over there, drunk soldiers, but at that time. But we had a good group, and we did a lot of things.
You did a lot of traveling when you were in the military. Where else have you been?
Well, after I had been in Japan a little over a year, I was pushing 14 months, something like that, I got a notice. And I have one here. That's another one, if I can find it, of where, because of the personnel, the government, the Senate, I should say, the Senate had voted to reduce the personnel in Japan. We had too many people there. And because I had over a year there, I was on the list to be discharged. So, I had no say in it. I was discharged. I was sent back to the States, and that was in March of 1950. Only a few, and in June, and I went back to civilian life. I got me a job, got me a car. I was having a lot of fun. And in June of that year, North Korea invaded South Korea. And I started hearing the news and read the papers. And my outfit was, the 1st Cavalry Division was sent up to Korea. One of the first ones. Ill-equipped, and I knew, because I worked in supply. I knew what they had. So I started seeing the casualties he was having in the newspapers. And I says, well, I'm going to go back. And I did. I re-enlisted. And I re-enlisted, and I got a paper. I was going to sleep it out here. I have a paper here that my initial orders. My initial orders, I don't know if you can read that or not. And it states right in there, I was supposed to go with the 1st Cavalry Division. And I went to Fort Knox. They sent me to Fort Knox to get my clothes and everything, the initial issue. And I got stuck there because of my Army job, my MOS, they call it, which is mechanical repair. It has right on here. And I was there for about 5 months. And I said, this is no way to go. I don't want to be working here, fixing toilets. That's what I was doing. I went down to personnel again. Now this will make the 3rd time I have been to personnel. I went down there. I took this. This is a copy, but I had the original in those days. I had the original indoctrination papers where I was enlisted. And I signed up for the 1st Cavalry Division. It was marked right on the paper. And the sergeant, I passed it to the sergeant that was at the desk at that time. He read it. And he said, what the hell are you doing here?
So you were on the road again.
So then...
Is that when you actually made the move to Korea?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So then I got my orders cut again, and a day later, I'm going to the West Coast, getting the boat to go to Japan. And from Japan, they sent me to Korea.
What was your impression when you first saw that place?
There's another project there where it was in the dark.
It was.
They put you on a ferry
Mm-hmm.
out of southern Japan.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was Sasebo. I think named it was the name of the port. And they put you on an old ferry. There was hundreds of us, and they would send us to Korea.
But when
it was at nighttime.
When you first got there, was there signs of fighting?
No. You see, we was issued our arms and all that. And we had equipment. Anyhow, we docked in Korea, and they put us right on a train. A rickety train that had all the windows shot out of it, bullet holes all over through it, and I think there was five cars. It's not a train like we have in the United States. These are small trains. I think there was about 25 or 30 feet long at the most, and there was five cars. They took us up north. We were in the southern part of Japan, Korea. And we got somewhere. I don't know the names of those towns over there.
Well, where was it when for how long were you there before you saw actual combat?
Well, the next day.
And it was hot and heavy, or was it?
No. I was assigned. Well, that's another. Let me get to the story. We disembarked from the train, and we was put in trucks. Well, the truck I was put in wasn't the 1st Cavalry truck. It was the 8th Army. And I got sent, another snafu, I got sent to the 8th Army. And I got stuck there, and I was put in the combat engineers, or heavy equipment engineers, really. Not the combat, it's two different organizations. I was put in heavy equipment. So for the next year, when I wasn't even that long, about 8 months, I was driving dozers and blasting mountains out. I got into demolitions then. I got another letter. I got another letter saying that the government was going to discharge me, and they have all these numbers, all these crazy numbers on on the paper, you know, and because of they want you to rotate the troops, and they rotated 2,000 of us, and I got back in the States. And I was getting situated. I had a job, of course. I never had a time finding a job. In my line of work, I was by this time I'm a machinist and machine builder and rebuilder. So I had a lot of work, and I had a lot of money, and then the Vietnam War breaks out. But by this time I'm married, and I was thinking about going back in.
Knowing Gloria, I would be surprised if you did.
Well, I didn't discuss it with her too much
I
because
didn't think so.
it would have been more or less my decision. Mm-hmm. But even so, we did talk about it, but I did not re-enlist. And I think I could have. Actually, I'm kind of discouraged about my time I spent in the service.
Now, why was
I
that?
think I would have made a long-term service person, but why they kept kicking me out all the time, I don't know why.
It was just one of those snafus, wasn't it?
I just happened to be there, and it was me.
Mm-hmm.
But in the service, I cannot say that I was dissatisfied being in the service. No, I enjoyed it.
Well, what was the worst time as far as being involved in actual combat? It must have been in Korea.
Well, at certain times, at different times over there, we was always under war conditions. Mm-hmm. We was right behind the combat itself. We was at the artillery range, mm-hmm. Which could be anything from 3 to 6 miles behind the line. And we had to build the roads mm-hmm. so that the artillery could be moved and also get the ammunition to them.
But isn't it true that you guys that did that were in constant danger of the enemy
yes.
wanting to bomb what you're doing?
Oh yeah, we was always armed. I had a 45 strapped on me, and I sent back to the States. I didn't like carrying that heavy 45, so I sent back to the States to a gun place, and I bought me a German Luger. Now, had no problem getting ammunition for it, because the Chinese were shooting it at us, same caliber. And we had a lot of equipment lost because in some areas we didn't always work 24 hours. We was on a 24-hour work job. And we didn't have always the capabilities of, and it was too far to go from one job to another back to the camp to go, rest. So we'd leave our equipment sometimes. And then whoever it was, the North Koreans or the Chinese, we always said it was the North Koreans, they would come in and throw grenades in the motors and all that kind of stuff and blow up the equipment. We didn't leave sentries around the equipment because they had snipers. And we were supposed to have security by the South Koreans. They had a company of them bivouacked by us, but they didn't do nothing. His first shots, they what they call bug out. But we was always under arms.
What was the most scary time, if there was one?
Oh, we did have that a few times. Yeah, they shot machine gun it up. We was in the mountains. I spent my whole time in Korea in the mountains, building bridges, and one railroad trestle that was blown up, and making roads. And it was a very good experience. I mean, no denying that I didn't learn a lot. I got into demolitions, and I set off truckloads of dynamite and TNT and C4 and anything we got our hands on, because we was using so much of explosives that you just took what you can get. And we was very careful about being out anywhere. Where we had our tent set up was usually on a riverbed, and because we had our equipment, we made stones. We'd take the gravel or stones from the riverbeds and make small stones out of the gravel. We had rock crushers, what they call machinery, called rock crushers, and
well, were
from
you
there,
exposed to the civilian population at all?
there was none. We were so far advanced, there was no civilians, none.
Well,
The towns are little villages. They didn't have towns; they had villages, maybe a half a dozen houses. They was desolated. I mean, they were all shot up, and nothing was left, as it was. That when the people had left, and it was all destroyed.
Well, you got some interesting looking boxes.
I spent all these years, a little over 4 years in the service, and on none of my discharges, I really was not given anything except one. When I was in Japan, I had a medal given to me when we got off a ship, and that was for the occupation of Japan. But it wasn't until just a year ago I was informed by a friend of mine that I should look into it and get to the Veterans Administration and see if I don't have some medals come to me. Well, I have 6 now.
Well, tell us what they are.
Well, I have a good conduct medal, of course. I have an occupation it's an occupation medal for Japan, and the other is a defense, a national defense medal. This is a Korean Service Medal. And this is a United Nations medal. And there's one more that I'm supposed to get, but the government hasn't issued it yet. It's a service medal for Korea. So I'll have 7 medals.
And you had 3 separate honorable discharges.
And I have 3 honorable discharges, so which is kind of hard to understand the situations on this. Let's have the long story. I just told it. And 1, 2, 3.
Well, Bill, now that you've been through all of these experiences and you're mustered out of the military and you come home, after all that time and being all that distance away and living in a totally different environment all that time, what was the transition to civilian life, to the United States, and being married? Were you married during your military time, or did that happen when you got out?
I had no problems between the military and the civilian transition. None at all.
Did you get any benefits from all of your years of service, like the Bill of Rights or anything like that?
Well, at that time, they still had the veterans schooling and all that, you know. I could have got in on that. The only thing that I got married in 57, and after I had been married for a while, my wife and I decided to buy a house. Well, through the GI Bill, I was qualified to get a loan, and so I went to a bank, and they wouldn't acknowledge the piece of paper I had, the certificate I had. And they said they don't give loans to GIs. So I went to another bank, and the same story. And it wasn't until I went to a savings and loan, which charged a higher rate, that I got a loan to buy a house through the GI Bill. And I didn't know until after I had bought the house, and years later, that the banks at that time was required to give you a loan. But the loan at that time, I think the government would only give them 4%, and they wanted more. But it's through my, they call it ignorance, unknowing what the GI Bill give you. And I think that that should be more emphasized on veterans.
Well, from what I'm hearing, they do talk about that more now. Veterans are more savvy, and there are agencies that they can go to get more information.
Yes.
But that was a long time ago.
Well, it's just things have changed since then.
Well, if you had to give advice to the young folks coming up through the ranks now that are thinking about going into the military, what would you say?
The advances that you can get in rank, and now it depends upon your own intelligence. How far you can go is how good you can think. And I had no problem. My problem was because of my transfers and all that. I wasn't consistent. I wasn't consistent of my service, and I got up to corporal. And when I was in Korea, I was informed that there was going to be a sergeant's stripe in there. Well, if I would have stayed there a couple more months, I would have got a sergeant's rank. And it's really my own fault, not my fault, but my jumping around in the service. I didn't. If you stay at one station, you have a better chance of getting rank, and that can help a lot of people.
But when you look at the difference between that rank back then and what you achieved in civilian life as a result of what you learned by the experiences that you gained through your moves. How do
Well,
you
that's-
think that played out?
I think that was very good. I would say that it's a good experience for a young guy. But a lot of people wouldn't adjust. I've seen that happen. You know, they go in and they're not satisfied. They can't take orders, and that's the big hang-up. They can't take orders.
Well, Bill, I have an order right now from my camera saying that our time is up, but I really want to thank you so much for allowing me to do this and listening to your fascinating story.
All right, thank
Do you
you.
have anything to say in closing?
Well, I had a very good experience in the service, and I could recommend that anybody that would like to join the service should.
All right, well, thank you very much.